A go. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first ever historians interview for the month of June here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And joining me today is a historian making their official debut here on the show. Now, my guest today is an historian focusing on diplomacy, international development, global economics, the environment, and the history of ideas. My guest has written a series of books as well as written numerous journals. One of his books is One Third Rich and Two Thirds Hungry, Development and Neoliberalism in the Late Cold War, published with Cambridge University Press of this year, which examines the United States Agency for International Development and uses foreign aid as a lens to look at Cold War politics, global North-South relations, and the expansion of neoliberal ideas. He's currently working on a manuscript titled A Dark Enlightenment, Liberalism and Democracy After the Cold War, which is about the long history of illiberalism and monarchist movements within the democratic West. And he's written a series of other journals and other papers along the way. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest, historian Christian Ruth. Christian, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me and for that fulsome introduction.
You're welcome, Christian. You're welcome. And I have to say, I've had a lot of historians on the show, but I don't think I've ever had an historian talk about diplomacy and international development as well as, global relations. That's a very, very fascinating topic. Would you like also to share with our viewers and listeners a little more in detail of what that pertains to the field of history?
Yeah. So the way I tend to explain it to students, is, your listeners will know this. Historians tend to be pretty specified in our research. And I always use the kind of Shrek onion metaphor. And so, my outermost layer, I do, modern history, but my innermost layers as you go in, I do what's often called diplomatic history. There's a bit of a naming crisis in my field and has been for about 20 years. As we don't quite know what to call ourselves because a lot of us don't really do diplomacy, very traditional political science diplomacy. A lot of the time I just say I'm an international historian. And a lot of what people in my field look at is the relationships between countries and people within those countries and their governments. But that could be a lot of things, right? And so my specialty is looking at international development. So we often think of that as like foreign aid. But that doesn't necessarily mean like disaster assistance. Like if there's a crisis, we send money or food, sure. But most of what I look at is the preemptive development work where you're trying to build up other countries' economies. And that gets into nitty-gritties of, economic history, history of ideas about economics or growth.
Right.
And a lot of what I do is human rights related work. The right to development or the right to have shelter, food, basic needs. And these things are quite interrelated. I got started looking at famine. That's how I got my into the field, which is incredibly depressing, of course. Most of my work feels very depressing, which I feel like is just a consequence of what I'm studying. But for diplomatic history is a very wide field. Our annual conference has people working on an infinite number of different topics. It's very expansive. If I toot the horn for my specialty, I think we're probably the most idea-wise one of the more diverse fields of history, for like professional historical analysis. Of course, everyone would say that of their own field, so that's
right.
But we do a lot of international work. Where I think we probably have the most number of non-American historians in our field, and so we're the spirit of multi-archival research. International research is, I think, at our best what we try to carry forth.
Fascinating. So before we dive more in depth into your field of study, let's talk a little bit more about you, Christian. So what would you consider the moment that really got you interested in the field of history? And from that point, when would you consider what would you consider your definitive aha moment when you realized you wanted to take your passion for history, your love for history, and build upon it and make it a career?
So I had a really, really good AP US history teacher in high school. Eons ago. I just turned 32 in January, so it was many, many, many moons ago now. And she was, I think she probably was the first teacher that really challenged me to think critically about history. And I'd always loved history. And that's coming from my grandparents who raised me, but she really pushed me to think, not just like memorizing facts and dates, but to think more analytically, more critically, more fulsomely. And that kind of ignited a spark that was already there. And when I graduated and went to college, I wanted to teach history, very much inspired by her example.
Right.
And I did my undergrad, and I realized that I had specialized wrong, and that I hadn't gone for a secondary education major. I'd gone for a history major, right? And then these things are very related, but one is more easily transitioned into a K through 12 teaching career than the other.
Right.
And so my senior year, I had a professor who became my master's advisor, and he basically said, you should just do the master's. You're good at writing, like you're good at the actual historical analysis. And not knowing what I wanted to do, I did that. And that turned out just fine. I wrote the thesis. I really enjoyed it. And so my love of research and teaching kind of equalized. And they remain pretty evenly split, which is probably not good. Because most people do one or the other as a focus, I think. But it snowballed. And I think my aha moment was when I started my doctorate. I had one of my first big research trips. I got some funding from the department, and I went to National Archives, where a lot of records that I look at are located. And I just sort of sat there for 7 hours from the moment the archives opened in College Park to the moment they closed. And it kind of just sparked the love of diving into records and thinking about it. And it's in some ways, I think, a very traditional moment for historians, right? You get into the archives finally, really get into the archives, and you can kind of see the tapestry of what you're looking at kind of pan out before you, and that
absolutely
a little addictive.
Nice. That's incredible. I've had a lot of friends who have said that going to National Archives is like paradise and like the ultimate place for any historian. I haven't gone there yet because I live in California, but I would always love to go to National Archives and just see, the records of history that have been kept and preserved. And that would just be heaven for me. I love to read, I love to write, and I love researching. So I can imagine you probably uncovered a lot of amazing stuff there for, your own personal research, as well as research for your books, your one that's out this year and the one you're currently working on. So let's actually talk a little bit about that for a moment. So what can you tell us a little bit more about, let's talk about your previous book before I get to your current one. So the book that came out this year, what can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's coming out this winter, and that's that was my doctoral dissertation. Like most people who do the PhD, you tend to turn your dissertation into your first book, especially if you're hunting for a tenure track job. And so the main topic is about USAID, like United States Agency for International Development, which was, technically still is, but it was our foreign aid apparatus, right? And within diplomatic history, the field, the historiography, like the body of research on foreign aid is pretty expansive. It's in development as a concept has been a major field within my field of history, a major topic for the last 20 years or so. And so most of the research has been done from after World War II through the early 1970s. And this gets into some major topics like the Green Revolution, for example, like crops, is a huge part of that story. And a lot of the research on development is focused on how did we measure growth, GDP? How did we change from that? And that's the thing I talk about. And also the Green Revolution, the kind of mechanics of development, and the way these things relate to international politics after World War II. So this gets into bigger discussions of decolonization after World War II, the Cold War especially. And these things are very interrelated. So how do poor countries after World War II, who are often former colonies, how do they grow? Do they grow? And the struggle to do that when you're trying to grow your country's economy and your society in a world that's dominated by superpower conflicts, nuclear war, post-war relations. And there's a lot of the Venn diagrams that exist within that subfield of history encompass things like human rights, economic rights, local politics, local cultures are a huge part of how this works out. And so for me, as someone who started the research when I was a master's student, really looking at famine and food history, and I love to cook, and food history was an early field I kind of glommed onto. It was a kind of natural progression in a lot of ways to look at what people ate, how do they get access to it, oh, they can't get access to it, why? And then you get into the kind of rigmarole of, if you're a poor farmer in Ethiopia, and I work a lot in the Horn of Africa, why can't you access your crops? Or why, what struggles are you going through that make it hard for you to kind of live your daily life? And that gets into unavoidably development, because you exist in an economy. Is that economy growing? Is it hampering you? And so for me, this was a kind of natural progression, seried events. And the book looks at my intervention in the field is looking at development after the Vietnam War. So really like 1958 onward through the end of the Cold War. And that's a newer time period that historians are looking at for development history. And that, really is coming from the fact that archives are just declassifying things over time. When I started my graduate career in 2014, the Reagan era materials were really just starting to be opened. And when I finished in 2022, my PhD, they were pretty open. So over that 10-ish year period, most of the Reagan materials have been opened, and now you're getting into George H.W. Bush and Clinton. There's a lag period for people who work in government documents, which most diplomatic historians, to one degree or another, do. Especially if you do really modern work, which I really do. I have friends who are medieval historians who joke that I'm a journalist because I interviewed people who were alive for my research. And so for me, it's a book that's on the agency, USAID. I discuss a lot of its history, how it changes over time, and the ideas that underpin those changes, because America was such an integral aspect to international development. In some ways, we kind of set the tone, we set the funding in various ways, and we kind of set the tenor of international development theory. And in turn, we're also changed by external factors and groups and people who were thinking through development. And so the book is a kind of dialogue in some ways around the agency, these various groups or factions or NGOs or agencies that talk to USAID and how they work or don't work, and how these ideas bounce off each other or sometimes work together. And my biggest intervention really is pushing the timeline through the end of the Cold War. So about a third of the book is set in the 1980s and in the Reagan years, which is a pretty unexplored area for development history within my field. I think the most recent works really go up to the end of the Carter administration. And so we're, and this is just normal, we're pushing that timeline forward as access to archives increases, and we're getting new documents. And I was lucky over the last 10 years to interview 4 or 5 pretty important people to that process, changing the development ideas. I was able to talk to the head of USAID during the Reagan years, and he's, and these people are getting older, so there's a certain time crunch to doing that, and I've been lucky to be able to do that. So the book makes a few, I think, important contributions. Also, it discusses the response by nations in the global South, Africa, Latin America, Asia, to development. Because development's on a one-way street. You can't just make countries. Well, that's a lesson we learned. You can't just make countries develop. It has to be cooperative. It should be a cooperative process. And also is something that is still hotly debated today. There's no single development theory, and that's still, it actually, even more than it has been in a long time, is being hotly debated currently. Development and foreign aid. So I discuss a lot of the responses from nations in the global South to changes in development that I research, and how they respond or disagree, often disagree, and how that relates to some big important concepts like sovereignty, post-colonial independence, and the biggest takeaway from the book, the big concept I really use to kind of pull a thread through everything, is the development of an idea called basic human needs, which is like, if I say that term, what would that mean for you? Like basic human needs?
Human needs, definitely, right to food, like the basic necessities, right to food, right to shelter, medicine, that's one, rights of property, to own their own property, like the necessities for every person to have, to function and to grow, which in turn would help the society grow, and then from there expand into the country. And I'm actually very curious, Christian, you provided a lot of great, information, and the amount of research that you told me really does show. So I'm very curious, when you began outlining the book, because as you said, this was a paper or thesis back in university years, and then you've taken and transformed it into a book. What were the goals you had in bringing this book to life, as well as the promise you're making to your future readers, both in the academic field and maybe those who had a broad understanding of the Cold War?
Yeah. So I say immediately, I was lucky. I think your listeners probably have an idea of how the doctoral process functions on some level. My doctoral committee really pushed me to make the dissertation book ready from the get-go. And so a lot of the heavy lifting I would have had to do after the dissertation, I had done during the writing process of the dissertation. Which was painful in the moment, but very much worth it, I think, now, because a lot of the extra research I did, a lot of the time spent scaffolding the concepts and writing and rewriting chapters and make sure the flow of the chapters work well together was done before I even finished the actual doctorate. So when I was pitching it to publishers, that was a pretty quick process, because I'd already done a lot of the heavy kind of nitty-gritty work that you tend to do after the fact, which is not like a brag. That was actually, I was really annoyed during the writing process when I was a grad student, but very much advocate for that if you have the time and space to do so. Sometimes you don't, and that's so fine. And for me, historians, I think, straddle the line of being both the best and the worst of academic writers, because naturally we tell stories, right? I mean, there's baseline historians going back through all of human history. Whether or not you call yourself a historian or were called a historian, you're telling human stories,
right? And
even historians who work with more abstract concepts like development or history of ideas, those ideas come from people. They don't just exist out in the void. And so for me, trying to pull through the process or the project these human connections, I think, are really important, really vital. And I ground the book and all of my writing always in people, in so much as I possibly can. And so I have a few major actors in the book, people I interviewed in some cases, or if they had passed away, you know, getting their records, people who were involved in development, people who were involved in USAID, or places like the World Bank, for example, as kind of threads that I run through the project. And every chapter always has at least their story or multiple of their stories kind of weaving together. And that's partly because, and I'm not just making it up, they interact, like these are vital people to the narrative that I'm discussing and or revealing.
Right.
But I think a lot of academic writing, this is a critique of academic writing in general, and historians sometimes especially, although I think we're really good at not doing this a lot of the time, that we forget people, right? And it's easy to knock, you know, like political science, for example, because they're particularly dealing with abstract concepts, in some cases figures and you know, statistics.
Right.
But for people who work in more, in history always straddles that line in the social science or humanities. But a lot of historians, I feel like, have read a lot of history books in my career, write really boringly. Even if the topics are really fascinating, the writing is just kind of boring. I think a lot of the reason for that is that they forget that these are people that they're talking about, and people are inherently interesting to other people for the most part. And you know, providing some biographical information is fine, but you know, if you find a juicy quote, use it. Like, you know, I think there are a lot of ways, and I can talk more about this, but there are a lot of ways to actually spice up, as I tell my students, academic writing without at all detracting from the information. In fact, spice is required for good cooking, right, and flavorful food. And so I think it adds to the quality of your work if you're able to both write interesting stories that are simultaneously simply factually interesting and reveal new information. I think the best historical writing does those things simultaneously. And the worst just info dumps, which is still very vital and really important, but it doesn't make it good writing. And I think there's a lot to talk about in academic writing beyond just history, about concision, the mechanics of writing. I'm a giant sci-fi and fantasy nerd, so I take a lot of writing cues from good writers who know how to write well. And that's, you know, I can get into that more, but does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely, Christian. And you actually provided something that's really, really important, which is, you know, for historians who are like transforming either their papers or projects they've worked on into an academic book, it's a little bit difficult for some people. Let's say if they've been like taught like the academic way of writing and now trying to replicate that into a book. You're absolutely right that you have to find this balance of, you want it to be factual, you want the information to be accurate, you want it to still get the point across, but you want to write it in a way that's not going to, you know, boggle the average reader with a lot of the academic jargon. Yes, those in the academic field are going to pick up the cues rather easily than your average reader. And that is something that we will be touching on when it comes to, you know, the business side of being a historian, as well as historians who are authors. But before we get to that, I did have a few questions I wanted to ask you. These are more personal, reflective questions, which actually this pertains to your book, which is, you know, I talked to a lot of historians on the show who have written a book either for Yale, for Cambridge, or something along those lines. And there is that hesitancy to take a paper or a dissertation and transform it into a book and share it with people, because the dissertation is usually for like a small committee, a small group of people who know your history, who know your approach to the source material. It's different when you share it with a large audience of people, complete strangers, and wondering, are they going to be open-minded? And especially now in digital age, for historians in general, it's a double-edged sword. Because on one side, we are able to meet those that are like-minded, who are open to new ideas. On the other side, unfortunately, we do leave ourselves exposed to a lot of hate speech, trolls, spam, a lot of negativity, which could completely derail an historian's confidence in themselves and their abilities. And that's very, very unfortunate, but it does happen. So I'm very curious, Christian, in your career, have you ever had moments of heightened anxiety or imposter syndrome? And if so, or if not, what has disciplined you to continue being the best historian that you can be, as well as instilling what you've learned onto your students?
That's a good question. It's a good series of questions. Yes, I mean, for sure, yes. I've had moments of imposter syndrome, or related, doubts. I am first generation college student, which in some ways is both good and bad, in the sense that, like, my grandparents who raised me passed away. So I don't have a lot of like familial pressure. I mean, they were very positively pressury. They were old school, so a little negative pressure. But I think it was positive overall. And for me, whatever pressure or doubts exist are really internal, and mostly are in relation to, this is for me, the external realities of like the job market or the field. Right? And as someone who tends to appreciate consistency and security, I picked a terrible profession, right? I mean, realistically, and also, frankly, a terrible time to be alive for it, because the job market's not good. Frankly, this is for the job market for academic history, working at a college as a professor, and that's the job market. But also, frankly, the job market for historical work in general is kind of getting some heavy blows from external factors the last few years, and probably will for the next foreseeable future. And I think that's unfortunate on a societal level for a lot of reasons. But for me, those kinds of external doubts are my biggest hurdle, because they tend to sap my energy to do like the research and work and writing that I need to do. And so for me, that's my biggest, it's external stabbing spears coming from weird angles from, just the world. I'm pretty confident in my research and writing ability, and that comes from having done it a lot, and also being validated by doing a good job, or being validated by being told I've done a good job. Right. Not in a egotistical, mind-blowing way. Just like, hey, you've done like steps. I feel confident I can do those steps. And because I've done them and they've been checked off pretty well consistently, I feel confident in doing that. So for me, and that's a privilege to say, right, that I've been able to do that and that I've done a good job, but also that's been validated. I feel like it's certainly a lot of people that I know, colleagues that I know, have done great work, but have never had that validated in the way like that then gives them the internal kind of momentum to just keep doing it easily. And I think that's coming from, for me at least, being very lucky and having a very good doctoral committee, who were, shout out Ryan Irwin, who was at SUNY Albany, which is where I went to my doctoral program, and my entire committee. Ryan Irwin was my main advisor, who were endlessly not approving, but endlessly supportive, right? I think endless approval is not good. Sometimes you need to be checked and challenged. Like that's part of growing, especially in academia, where you're supposed to be revising and thinking, right? And so I was very lucky to have a very good doctoral committee who I think instilled in me lessons that go beyond the doctorate. I mean, these are just eternal lessons for writing, research, growing, thinking critically and healthily. So that's the great privilege of having good people, which I think is a huge issue for a lot of historians, academic historians. It's just the academy is not generally supportive, and most doctoral programs, I think, are not as supportive as they could be. And I also have paired with this, a lot of friends. Like most of my friends I made in my doctoral program or my master's program, or like, spinoffs or adjacent friend groups from those, which is so normal. But also like but I have those groups. I have those groups, writing groups, for example, right? And these are the kinds of support networks that you need, I think, as an academic, but that just also because you're a human being, and human beings need friends, and I'm a giant introvert, but like, you need a social network, an actual social network, not Facebook, an actual social network of people who you can talk to and spin ideas off of and get their opinions on. And for me, those are the biggest kinds of like foundational pillars that get through, moments of doubt or moments of like lethargy, when I'm like, well, big external events are happening that are very depressing or cast doubt on the future job prospects. That sucks, but I have a lot of ways to kind of work through that. And doing this for 10 plus years, you develop methods, right? Make sure you take downtime. I run a lot, play a lot of video games, read, paint. You need hobbies.
Mm-hmm.
I think these are things that even if I wasn't a historian doing what I do, I think those are just healthy things in general. And I think that carries through no matter your specialty or your field. You just need, you can't forget you're a human being.
Yes.
Yeah.
You actually touched on a lot of great stuff, Christian, and one of them, which I think ties perfectly to the business side of being a historian, is, of course, what I like to call the paths for historians, because I think you would definitely agree that for anyone who goes into the field of history, there's generally two paths for us. There's either the academic path to go the way of a teacher, and then there's the government path, whether you work in the government on some level as an historian. And sometimes, that may not work for most people. Some people may not want to be teachers, and some people may not want to work in the federal government. And that's why, some people have been forging their own path, their own middle path, which is arguably the most difficult. And I know that from experience. I didn't go down the way of, being a teacher, or I tried working or applying to the federal government. It's not easy just because of the skill sets. And I've had to pick up some skills along the way, but I was able to, sort of combine a lot of other different assets to, build a career some way or somehow as an historian, as a magazine writer for history magazines, which I love to do. I love to write, but generally that's not the more comfortable path to do. It worked for me, but then it might work for everybody else. So let's talk a little bit about the business side of being an historian and really shine some light on that aspect. So let's go use your book as an example, Christian. So when you began writing that and, getting it formatted before, sending it to an editor for proofread, did you still want to target the academic audience, or rather, did you have a readership that you were trying to hit? And this goes back to what's in the beginning, which is, I transitioned from a paper to a book that already had an established audience, but now that it's going outward to the public, it may be a good idea to expand one's readership.
Yeah, that was a graceful way to remind me of the question you asked, by the way. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I think so. For me, and this gets into a bigger question also of the second book, which I'll tie in a bit. For me, given everything I just said about the job market, right? I mean, like, I'm in a postdoc fellowship right now. Very lucky to have gotten it. And I'm still angling for an academic job as much as I'm able to do so. I'll just cross my fingers and eyes and toes and everything. And so that's the context simply for the career context for the first book.
Right.
For me, the first book is for sure an academically minded one. I mean, it's with Cambridge, and there's a certain, I think, connotation, especially for my field, of that being like a academically incisive book. So the audience is mainly academics. For me, there's a caveat, though, of that should not mean that the audience that reads it only has to be academics. And for me, especially given my strong opinions on academic writing should be better, period. That means that I write for a academic audience and also a broader audience.
Right.
And when I, in terms of formatting or writing, but also in terms of marketing or thinking about the way that I pitch the book and describe the book, I want it to be relatable, even if you're not a diplomatic historian, right?
Right.
Because realistically, there are only a few thousand diplomatic historians in the world, right? That's a very small number of people. The tiny town in Kentucky I lived in while I did my undergrad had more people than there are academic historians in my field. So why would I only write for 2,000 or 3,000 people? And I was told that by a professor in my master's program, and that really stuck with me. I think it applies to no matter what your field is, because if you only write for a tiny audience, and you only ever write for a tiny audience, in some ways I think you're doing yourself a disservice, because you could be doing so much more in terms of promulgating knowledge, spreading information that you uniquely have, and perspectives and ideas that you uniquely have, that are inherently limited if you just write to 1/10 of a stadium full of people out of a world of billions of people. I always found that kind of ridiculous when I realized. I was like, oh wow, shoot. Well, and then that got me thinking really of how to make my writing better, mechanically. And in terms of business, I think that these things are quite related, because a lot of what we do is writing, right?
Right.
So how we approach that foundationally is simply a part of our business as well. In terms of how we pitch ourselves, how we sell ourselves, no matter what kind of job, actually maybe in particular because of what jobs you're applying to or wanting to get into field-wise, that's pretty critical. And for a lot of younger historians like myself, I have a lot of gray hairs now, and I'm in my early 30s, but I still feel young. And I think that the kind of sea changes in academia that we've experienced, if you're below the age of 35, are hard to relate to if you are 40ish or above, maybe 45ish or above, simply because it's a different experience. And as historians, we should be able to understand and respect lived experiences and time if we can understand anything. And I think this is not always the case at all. I think there is sometimes a disconnect for more established and older scholars, 50ish or above, who understand in the abstract the difficulties of the job markets, or the changes in academic research techniques, data-driven research, right? I think digital history, these are areas that and this is the case for any field of research, there's just a disconnect. They didn't experience it, they didn't live through it in the same way that we did. And I think that it sometimes causes a kind of gap in expectations or understanding, or things of that nature. And that's not at all universal at all. But I think there's a generality present where established professors will sometimes still tell grad students, no, you don't really need to be good at teaching. You can just really focus on research. No, you can't. And I experienced that when I was going through my doctorate. An older emeritus professor said that basically in the kind of introductory class. And we all kind of vehemently disagreed with him. And he was really adamant, no, you don't really need to learn how to teach. Teaching's dumb. Almost verbatim, teaching's dumb. I wish I didn't have to teach. That's fine. Fine. You can have that opinion. I think it's a terrible and misinformed and ill-advised opinion. Because teaching made me a better historian, right? I think teaching makes you better at what you should, at least make you better at what you do and what you know. Because students ask you the weirdest questions sometimes.
That is true.
They challenge your opinions. They make you rethink how you present information. And to get to what you were saying earlier, also in terms of translating your research into a book format, an approachable book format. Teaching was a huge part of that on some level, because I think it's important for us as scholars to incorporate our research into our classes, in so much as we're able to fit the curricula and such. And having done that a fair amount, it successfully or not, right? Frankly, I think those lessons of learned from trying to present my research not at a conference, but to undergrads, freshmen, right? That made me dramatically revise how I thought about my work, not the content, but the presentation, right? And those moments are pretty integral for me to thinking about how I present information, who hears it, and how they hear it. And I hope scholars do more of that. I certainly was told to take that perspective by my graduate advisors. And I think that they were all wonderful, because that's a really important perspective to have, to not put yourself on a pedestal like you know everything, because then you both become a bad teacher and also, I think, a bad scholar, to be frank.
That's very true. That is very true. And this kind of leads to another discussion, which I've been having with a lot of historians, which I feel that out of all of the disciplines, or out of all the studies in university, I definitely feel the history field, the department, is probably the one area of study, the one field of study that doesn't really have a lot of real world or hands-on workshops for students to truly understand that there are avenues to use your history degree. Because again, as we talked about before, generally speaking, when you go into the history field, there are two paths: the academic and the federal government. And at my university, for my graduate school, which was at San Francisco State, I had the opportunity to take part in a workshop, which was History and Beyond, how to use history in other fields. One of which was, there was an author on the panel who took his passion for history and used it to write books. And I took his words to heart and developed my own stories. And to give like an example, one that really stuck out with me, with my background being in classical history, was, of course, Amanus, Son of Persia. It's a fictional book, but the research behind it is, the Persian world and the Greek world, and I want it to be as accurate as possible. Again, that element of, you want to teach people, but in a way that is not academic jargon, but still fun and engaging. So ultimately, Christian, in your opinion, do you feel that the history field should have more workshops like these to really help students get an idea of, not just a better understanding of their field in history, but show them that there are different avenues to build a career upon if they decide not to go down the two paths?
Yeah, yes, for sure. Also, first of all, did you take Latin?
No, I did not.
Okay. I did. Useless for my research, but I was going to make a Latin joke. Okay, so yes, yeah, absolutely, yes. I think those kinds of workshops, and like career workshops, writing workshops, career focused ones, are really, really important. I did my master's and my undergrad at University of Kentucky, and my PhD at SUNY Albany. And I was lucky that at both places, the departments were very proactive in doing that. I disregarded all the advice and still kept going straight through for academia, and also because of what I do, especially government-oriented work, for sure. Right? But those are still really important, because, like, for me, certainly, those two areas of work that I would like to go into are not doing great right now. And so I've always maintained the keen awareness that for me and my future, right, and that's just career-wise, you can't lock yourself into assuming you'll get one of the two main career paths, because you might not. In fact, numerically, you probably won't, and that's sad to think about. And you can't think about it all the time, or else you'll just be depressed. But you have to be realistic about these kinds of things. If I can make a reference to a fantasy book series, anyone who knows Logan Nine Fingers will get that joke. So yeah, I think these are really, really critical, because undergrads don't know that. Why would they know that? But your job is to tell them information, right? And I think there's such a diversity in careers that people can do with a history degree, whether it's a BA, an MA, or a PhD. Because at heart, it gives you, and this gets harped on a lot, but it really bears repeating, critical analysis, reading, writing, but also sorting information, right? Drawing connections between abstract concepts, and the ability to create long-term research projects or long-term multi-geographic, multilingual research projects is universally helpful. If you just describe the basics of what you would do as a historian doing like a manuscript length project, but didn't say anything about doing historical work, it would sound like you're like an upper level manager at a company, because that's kind of what you're doing, right? You just, instead of a TPS report or some kind of nonsense, it's a more complex, to me at least, a more complex research project. But the actual mechanics are universally applicable because it's just thinking through things well. And this gets into much bigger discussions of AI and how that impacts the workplace.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
And that longer than this interview can take. But I think making people aware that the skill sets that you learn are, to me at least, hopefully, will outlive and already outshine the capabilities of artificial generative intelligence. If it gets to a point where AI can do my job for me, then I think there's much bigger problem. Things are much broader changing than can easily be addressed regardless. So I think those workshops are really critical, because whether you're working for the Park Service, at least as of 4 months ago, museums, and while historical degrees do not actually translate easily into museum work all the time, which is important to bear in mind, because it's easy to assume that they do, but museum studies is a field for a reason. Library sciences exist as an independent field for a reason.
Yes.
No, historical people with a history BA do not assume you can hop into that work simply.
No.
Which is a common error that I think undergrad departments should tell students more. But those kinds of workshops are really critical. Or working as a book editor, right? I know several book editors who started out as history BAs or history MAs, and those are just universally useful skills. Even beyond academia or book-related things in general, one of my good friends just works as he's a manager at a pretty big department store, but he draws on the skills that he learned. He makes more than I do, right? By far. And he draws on the skills that he learned as a medieval historian to do that job very well. And I think this is, even just beyond history, I think skill sets and knowledge and the ability to think well are just good, period. And they will tend to, but not always, they will tend to serve you well in life. And I think history is particularly good at imparting those skills. I'm biased, obviously, but yeah.
Very true, Christian. And just to further add on to that, definitely what is important in the field of history is networking, which is very crucial in the field. I've had the opportunity to network with a wide range of other historians, from modern historians, war historians, food historians, and I've learned a lot from them, which have in turn helped me figure out what kind of historian I want to be. Because a thing that I don't think gets talked about as much is when you're in the field of history, when you are going through the academic journey in school, you are taught multiple different styles of study, multiple different disciplines, and you're trying to balance the two of what kind of historian do you want to be. And that can be very difficult. So, Christian, in your opinion, how important is it to network as an historian? And do you believe that networking helps young historians discover what kind of people they want to be in this field?
Yes, networking is really, really important. I hate, and that being said, I hate networking, but I'm an introverted, nerdy, awkward person. To be fair, I feel like this is a generality. Most people who are doing a PhD or like an MA are probably introverted nerds on some level. And over time, I think, especially working in DC for a year or so, DC is an area of the world that only exists because of networking. I feel like,
Right.
It was certainly like a trial by fire, and I'm not going to say that I'm good at it. I don't really think I could be much better. I'm a bit of a wallflower, but the reality is, I think in the healthiest way, networking is just making friends, or it should be. They don't need to be close best friends, but like a healthy conference you go to as like a graduate student is one where like you make like it to me at least one or two people who you can stay in contact with like once or twice a year, and maybe you do a conference in the future together. That's great. You've net benefited everyone involved, yourself included, and these are people who you can maintain like a long-term relationship with, even if you only talk a handful of times a year. That's still better than nothing, right? And that kind of thing, especially as you're a developing historian, I mean, trying to figure out what you want to do, and even undergraduate conferences, the same. Right? Any kind of undergraduate networking you do is also really important, whether it's going to a conference or an event on campus, or even just talking to all the professors in your department or like a neighboring school's department to get a feel for the areas of history that exist that you might not even know about, that you could be interested in. I think exposure to information is just always good, right?
Yes.
And for historians especially, we should be very open to simply learning and taking as much as you can. And I think networking is hard because socializing is hard, or it often is. And I think simply accepting that reality and kind of muddling your way through it as best as you are able within your limitations is all you have to do. And whatever you get from that is usually worth it. And that's coming from someone who hates networking so much. And I still do it constantly because you kind of have to, and also because there are simply benefits to doing so. So, I go to that bowling party you don't want to go to, leave early if you need to, but still try. And I think usually there's some benefit to doing it.
Absolutely, Christian. Absolutely. And we now arrive at the final question of this amazing interview. Now, this one, Christian, is a very loaded question, so I'll definitely give some context for it. So I've been doing this show now for about 6, going on 7 years. I've interviewed a lot of authors from the fiction side, nonfiction side, as well as the academic side. I've interviewed historians from professors, students, independent, reenactors. I've learned a lot from these incredible people. And I realized, just like an author in the field of history, there are two paths: to be an historian and to be known as an historian. One is dedicated to the scholarship, the other is dedicated to building a career off of it. And they both lead to the same goal, which is world-renowned success and fame. But I definitely feel the second path, for first-time historians, that's the most enticing, but leads to a lot of unrealistic goals and expectations. And the harsh truth about this, as we've kind of touched on a little bit, that this is not a career that's a easy moneymaker. Will we like it to be? Absolutely, but that is not the case. And in the field of history, just like any other discipline or any research-based discipline, there is no guarantee your first anything is going to be the start of your legacy. Are there exceptions to the rule? Absolutely, but those are the exceptions. Generally speaking, not every first-time historian is going to be successful with their project, whether they transform a PhD paper into a book, or whether taking their dissertation and making it into a presentation in front of a committee. Generally, that's not going to be the case. So here's a little scenario, a little scenario for us to play with. Let's say you are at a workshop with a lot of other academic students, ranging from entering freshmen to college graduates in their master's or their PhD. And almost like the workshops that we just mentioned earlier in the interview, how would you tell these students, hypothetically, that in this career, there is no guarantee that you're going to be a success, whether if you go down the way of an academic professor or a government employee, financially speaking, but you should never take the personal losses to heart, but instead build upon them to grow. Because a quote I always like to say is, grit transforms into talent. And we only get better as time goes on from our own research and the help of others.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think you know, if I was stuck in a room doing like, you know, presentation wise, yeah, I think that is my grandfather, who was a train conductor for all of his life, really honed in the measure twice, cut once kind of mentality for my life, I guess, but also just that's kind of a foundational bit for me of, you know, I think success is usually or should be defined particularly by how you think of it. And so, you know, financial success for one person might not be the same as another person's idea of what it means to be financially successful.
Right.
And I think that's important to keep in mind, but also I think you got to be realistic about what that could mean, though. So, you know, it's okay if you are okay with making 40,000 a year doing several history jobs or something, as an example, right? And like if you love teaching, you know, like I adjuncted a lot. I avoided the adjunct trap mostly, but like that's quite hard. One semester I taught like 7 classes, which is way too much, right? But I simply needed to financially, and I the classes were good, like they were fine, but like I was very tired all of the time, and I'm sure the classes could have been better if I wasn't teaching 7 classes, right? And so for me, I emphasize this to students or like mentees. You need to figure out what your outer limits are and what your boundaries are for what you're willing to sacrifice, even if only for a time, to do what you enjoy doing. Because everyone has, to one degree or another, outer limits of what they're able to do while still loving it. And you can love something and not make it your career, which just sucks, right? But sometimes it might even be better depending on who you are as a person. This varies widely. And I think there needs to be a line drawn in the sand that falls entirely where you place it,
Right.
as you do that over time. Because like it's not easy to raise like a family, for example, when you don't make a lot of money. And that's just the reality of living in present America reality, right?
Yeah.
Economically speaking. And so if you're okay with that, okay, great. Then you can still live a fulsome life and enjoy it and still do the historical work you love as much as you want. And that's fine. But if that actual day-to-day reality is hard financially, then you really should rethink it. And I've had to do that before, for sure. Like there simply comes as an economic historian, there simply comes a point in time where the ledger starts to run red or black, right, in terms of your finances.
Right.
And that's the just unfortunate reality of the current system. And finding where that line falls for you is really critical. And I think it's better to find it earlier than later. But sometimes you don't know until you've reached that point. But just to be alive to that fact that even if you love history and love teaching or love research, that might not be something you're able to do forever. And that is bad. That sucks. There's no way around that. And accepting that reality sucks. But you kind of have to do it, because if you don't, you might find yourself in a situation you hate even more, where you're stuck, or you find yourself resenting the work rather than enjoying it. And that would be, to me at least, that would be even more frustrating. So those are simply hard conversations that people need to have. And this applies to anything, even beyond history, any kind of work, any kind of field. There's usually a make or break point in your life. And finding that is, important.
Absolutely, Christian, and excellent words of wisdom to end this incredible historian's interview. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for an amazing episode here on the channel. A huge thank you to Christian for making his official debut on the channel. Hopefully, this won't be the last time we have him on the show. So, again, a huge thank you to Christian for coming on the show and telling us all about his field, his book, and what he is working on. Now, Christian, where can people find you if they want to reach out and connect, as well as buy a copy of your book that's coming out this year?
So I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. You can find me on a Substack that I will tell you about. that I'm starting because everyone has a Substack nowadays, and I should do that. I'm not on Twitter because I don't want to be on, sorry, X. But please reach out. My institutional email is on my is on my LinkedIn. You can find my book coming up at Cambridge University Press at all places books are sold, Amazon included. And my second book will be something that you can find in several years when I finish writing it. But I have several articles coming out in relation to it, and if you were curious, I will tell you about those as well.
Awesome. Awesome. I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us for another amazing episode here on the channel. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to stay up to date with all the upcoming episodes for this week and the rest of the month of June. And as always, make sure to, again, like, comment, and subscribe and share with your friends and family. And until next time, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. And we'll see you all next time.